Hello and welcome to the Inkscape tutorial. Now, when you're doing scientific research, when you're writing papers, when you're developing new ideas, it's always a good idea to try communicate your results to the community by developing beautiful and professional graphics. And that's what today's tutorial and workshop is all about. We're going to be learning how to use software known as Inkscape, which is a type of Illustrator software and should come in handy in your daily life for when you're creating new graphics to put in your papers, to put in your blog posts, or wherever else you like to distribute your research. And one of the things you might be thinking is, well, why do I need to learn a separate piece of software? Why isn't, for example, PowerPoint good enough for me? And the answer is that Inkscape, on the one hand, it's free and open source, so that's a big plus. But also it's an Illustrator software, so it's specifically designed for creating professional graphics in mind. So it's not just some presentation software. And we'll find that it's actually much more sophisticated in terms of its power and functionality than, say, PowerPoint. But also it's much more relevant for what you need to do than, say, Adobe Photoshop, which is designed for modifying images, right? And is also expensive. Okay, so Inkscape really is the right tool for the job. And throughout today's workshop, we're going to be using materials and documentation that's included in this GitHub repository, and the link will be in the description of this video. And what I recommend you do is you go ahead and download it, click the download, and just install it on your local system. And we'll be needing to use some of the files later on. Just to mention that there's a README document in this GitHub, and this README document essentially summarizes all of the key techniques and skills that we learn over the course of this workshop. So I recommend that after the workshop you can use this document here as kind of a quick reference guide to refresh your memory and have a chance to try something in more detail that you didn't quite have a chance to do the first time round. Okay, so without further ado, unless you don't already have Inkscape, so if you don't have Inkscape you will need to download it. You can do it for Mac, for Windows and for Linux. There's detailed instructions here in the README document. Okay, it's quite simple to download like any other application. And so I'll go ahead and open it up on my system, my local system. I'm using Windows today, so this will mean that potentially if you're on a different operating system, some of the shortcuts might be a little bit different, but I'll try to identify those where they come up. So yeah, once you enter Inkscape, you have in front of you your beautiful fresh canvas. And in order to navigate around the canvas, in Windows at least, you can just scroll like in any other application you're familiar with, and you can pinch to zoom and all of that usual stuff. In Linux, it might be a little bit different. You might want to click Control and then the arrow keys, and that will allow you to shift around. And also, if you want to zoom in, you can just press the plus symbol. That will allow you to zoom in. And if you want to zoom out, you can just press the minus symbol, just like that. Okay, so we're going to begin by looking at shapes in Inkscape, because of course they are a very fundamental part of any graphic. So let's look at how we can create shapes, how we can manipulate them, and how we can edit their appearance and properties to make it look like exactly what we want it to be. So first things first, Inkscape on the left hand side here has several buttons, dedicated buttons for creating shapes. So if you want to create rectangles and squares, go ahead and click that button. Also, for everything in Inkscape there's a shortcut, so if you want to click that, you can also just press R on your keyboard and that will automatically select this button here. So to create the shape, it's very easy. You just kind of click and drag in a kind of intuitive way like this, so you can create shapes of different sizes and scales. And if you want to create regular shapes, so say a regular square, then you can hold down the Control key whilst you create a shape. So hold down Control and create, and that kind of forces Inkscape to create a regular shape. So when you hold down Control and move, you create a regular shape with a vertex located at the first location that you touch the canvas, right? So if I touch the canvas here and hold down Control, my shape's vertex is just where I initially touched. But if you hold down Control and Shift at the same time, and you also try to create the shape, it will also be a regular shape, but this time its centroid will be located at the point where you first touch the canvas. Okay, so slightly different manipulations going on there. So that's Control and drag, and then that's Control Shift and drag. Okay, they have slightly different functionality. So that's kind of squares, and with circles it's just the same idea, right? You can have oblong-like circles, and if you hold down Control, you could also get proper circles, nice symmetric ones. And to quickly select this tool, there's the E shortcut here. So R selects the rectangles and E selects the ellipsoids. And the next one here, if you want to create stars and polygons, you can click the star key on your keyboard, or you can click this button here. And by default this would actually be on 5 corners. So you'll have a 5-sided, 5-pointed star. But you can also convert that to a pentagon by clicking here. And you can create regular polygons of arbitrary numbers of sides just by flicking through. So most useful probably is a triangle, because every now and again you might want to do a triangle. But also you can have interesting things like 4-pointed stars and that kind of stuff. Okay, so that's how you create the shapes. Now, how do we manipulate them? So you might have noticed me earlier selecting a few of these guys. So if you come over here to this arrow key here, you can select it with S, the select tool, and you tap on a shape. It will bring up this selection, and you can modify the dimensions of your shape by just dragging in the quite intuitive way. So if you want to kind of scale the corners or make it skinnier or wider, you can do that quite easily. But also, if you tap on the object again whilst it's selected, you will then change these adjustment arrows to be rotation arrows. So if you hold a corner one down, you can now rotate your shape an arbitrary number of degrees, which of course is very useful. And in addition, you'll see these arrows here at the top and bottom and at the sides. These are for creating skew transformations. Okay, so you just hold them down and you can skew your shape in various directions, which is quite lovely. You might have noticed that all of my shapes are a rather boring, dull tone of beige or something like that. And on your computer, you'd likely have a slightly different color by default, maybe black, for example. And if you want to change the color of the shapes, that's quite straightforward. So you can select it. And first of all, there is this color bar down at the bottom of Inkscape. So you can just quickly say, I want that to be red, I want this to be blue, I want this to be black, and so on. You might have noticed that my blue does not look like a deep blue and my red does not look like a deep red, and that's because if you right click and you go to fill and stroke, this is where you can modify the colors more in detail, and you'll see in my case I already have about a 50% opacity, so they're slightly transparent. So I can bump that up to 100% and I could have a nice solid red color, and of course I can shift all the way along the color wheel and I can create whatever kind of color that I desire. Okay, so there's a few tools here. There's the hue, there's the saturation, there's the light and dark, and then there's the alpha channel, so how transparent it is. And it's pretty intuitive how to modify these to your fancy. There are more sophisticated ways of filling in shapes, like if you want gradients and so on. There's several patterns here that you can select and adjust, but for the most part you probably won't be needing those in your figure graphics, but you can explore those later. But another important part of a shape, of course, is its outline. So if you click on stroke paint, by default there will be no outline. So stroke refers to the edge of the shape in Inkscape jargon. Okay, so by default there's no stroke paint, so there's no edge. But if you click on flat color here, that automatically will create a nice edge for you. And just as with the fill color, you can also adjust all of the appearance preferences here. But for now I quite like a black edge, so I'll keep it like that. And if you want to modify the edge a bit more, in a bit of a more detailed way, you can click this stroke style, and you can make the edge thicker by clicking the plus. You can make it thinner by clicking the minus. You can also modify the dashes, so you can change it from a solid line to a dashed line, for example, and there's various different types of dashes. So that's how you can create rather nice borders around your shapes. Now, another thing you might want to do, particularly with rectangle-like shapes, is you might want to give them rounded corners. This can look quite nice when you're drawing like flowcharts or infographics and this kind of stuff. So to give a shape rounded corners, you need to select it with the Edit Paths by Node tool. So it's one step down from the arrow tool. So click the Edit Paths by Node, and then you'll have this kind of interface around your shape. Now the important node here is this circular node, because if you drag that downwards, it will smoothly produce rounded corners for your shape. Okay, so I can select this square with the same tool, and I can smoothly move that circle downwards, and I can get nice rounded corners on each of my shapes, which is quite nice. Now, of course, you might want to create some custom shapes, some freehand shapes. So how do you do that? Well, you come over here to the Draw Freehand Lines tool. You can select that with the P key on your keyboard as well. And essentially all you need to do is just click and move and click and move. So each time you'll have to re-click from the point where you finished. And you can create arbitrary shapes by using this tool. Now, you might have noticed by default it just falls back on whatever fill and stroke tools you were using before. So that's why it's blue with a dashed line. But of course you can modify that in just the same way if you wanted to change that. So that's how you can kind of create irregular shapes. And one final thing you might want to do with shapes, particularly if you're trying to do something quite advanced, is to combine existing shapes in different ways. So, for example, if I go ahead and, well, let's just make this opaque just for fun, and let's make this guy opaque as well. If I go ahead and select these two shapes here, this blue quadrilateral and this red oval, then what I can do is I can go to Path, and you'll see that there's all sorts of set operations that you can do on shapes, actually. So on any object in Inkscape, so you can take the union of those objects, you can take the difference, intersection, exclusion, and division. So for example, if I union these two, I just get one overall blue shape with this little bulge on the side. And if I, for example, select these two shapes, and I now do path, and then I do difference, I then essentially can cut out one shape from another. And again, I could maybe select these two shapes. I could select them both by dragging over them. I could go to path, and I could do things like exclusion, and I could get rather interesting looking shapes like this. Okay, so you can play around with those tools. They're under path, and there's all these set tools that you can play around with. Another thing you might want to do, which is quite related to shapes, is drawing arrows. So how do you draw an arrow in Inkscape? So to do that, you need to go to your freehand line, and you just create a line as you would normally. So you just click where you want it to start, and you click where you want it to end. And you can modify the stroke style. So in this case it was on dashes, and maybe I don't like that, maybe I want it to be solid. So at the moment this is just a solid line, but to make it into an arrow you just modify the markers options here. So you can just click down here and you can put on an arrowhead, and there you have an arrow. And if you want to make it a double-headed arrow, then that's quite easy too. You just click down the marker on the other side of the line, and you also select an arrowhead for that, and then you have a nice double-headed arrow, which you can then select with the selection tool, and you can manipulate this like any other object in Inkscape. So you can twist it and turn it, and you can expand it, and so on. Okay, so that's how you can create arrows in Inkscape. One final thing to note is grouping objects. It's probably quite familiar to you from PowerPoint. You just select them, click Ctrl-G, and now you've just got one group of multiple objects. And in Inkscape there's always multiple ways of doing the same thing, which can be useful but can also be a little bit confusing. But for example, if you want to group, you can select, and instead of doing Ctrl-G, you can also do Object Group. That will do exactly the same operation. Okay, so one final thing to mention about shapes, and this is particularly useful if you're creating, say, an academic poster, is how to arrange them in a regular order or pattern. So let me just create a few new shapes to give you an example of how this can be easily done. So let me create some space, and I'll go over here and just draw a few squares. Let's say for this illustration I want to have lots of squares that are all the same shape, so I can just copy and paste them a few times. Now, one thing you might be tempted to do when you do this kind of thing is try and manually arrange them in some grid or some order that you think is suitable for your poster or your graphic. But of course we run into all sorts of problems when you do that, so when you zoom in you see that there's all sorts of little imperfections and they're not really perfectly aligned. So in Inkscape there's a cool tool to save you some time. You just select the shapes that you want to align. You then go to Object and go down to Align and Distribute, tap that, and then it brings up this side panel here, and there's all sorts of ways that you can distribute and rearrange using this panel, but probably the simplest is just to go to Grid, select the number of rows and columns, and then hit Arrange, and then it just works, right? What if you want 3 rows and 2 columns? Arrange, done. What if you want to change the spacing? Well, that's easy. You can choose your column spacing here. Let's say I want to double my column spacing. Arrange, done. And if I want to treble my row spacing, I can do that as well. So that's something really useful to be aware of. Of course, these are still individual objects, so you can then move them around as you please. Okay, so to recap, that was Object and then Align and Distribute. Okay, so now let's move on to text manipulation in Inkscape. So to start creating text, you click the text icon in the left panel, and it's quite intuitive. You just tap where you want some text, you write something. Now in my case I already had some interesting fonts selected, so obviously you can select the text in the usual way, and you can modify the font, modify the style, modify the size, and maybe I want that a bit bigger. And text, like any object in Inkscape, also can be manipulated with the right click and the fill and stroke side panel. So in particular I can get rid of this ugly looking border around my text, and I can make the text black, or I can change its color in pretty much any way I desire. Now, some other things you might want to do with text, besides changing the font and changing the size, is making minute adjustments to spacings. Now, this can be quite useful when, for example, you've made some figure in, in Python, and you want to import it into Inkscape, but the figure caption titles are just not quite fitting in your graphic, and you need to make some fine adjustments. So to do that, you just select the text, and you can click the spacing option up here at the top. And this box on the left controls the spacing between letters. This box on the right controls the spacing between words. So for example, if you are short of space and you need to decrease the spacing between letters, you can do that by modifying this box. And if you wanted to, for example, increase the spacing between words, you can do that just as easily. Okay. This also allows you to do more fine-grained manipulation. So if I just want to do something about this word here, I can click spacing, and I can do things like rotate it by, say, 45 degrees, or I can shift it, say, vertically upwards by 20 units. And as you can see, I can kind of do individual manipulations like that. So that can be quite useful if you've got one letter which happens to be slightly out of line, then you can just shift its vertical location just by a few millimeters, and you can correct your text. So at the moment, this text is treated as regular text, which is selectable, highlightable, and all of that stuff. But each individual letter is not actually treated as a separate object in Inkscape. Not yet. So how do we do that? How do we treat each letter as a separate object? So to do that, you have to select the text with the Select and Transform Objects arrow up here. And then you go to Path, and you click Object to Path. Now, it looks like nothing's happened, but actually, now every letter is a separate object. So for example, if you wanted to select just this letter A and manipulate it, you can double click a few times, and you now have the A as a separate object, and you can now manipulate this in all the usual ways that you're familiar with. So that pretty much summarizes all you need to know about text manipulation in LaTeX, in Inkscape. Now, if you want to import, if you want to work with images in Inkscape, we have to import them. And the way to do that is through File Import. So in the workshop materials, which you should have downloaded, you'll find that there's this neuron.png. So just double click that, and it should bring up the image into Inkscape. Now, this is treated as any other object, so you can just manipulate it in the usual ways. You can hold down Control whilst you adjust its dimensions to make sure that it stays in regular dimensions. And now you have this image in Inkscape. Now, one thing that often happens when you start importing images, you start creating shapes, is that your graphic starts to become a little bit complex. You know, you might have something over here and something up here and something down here, and now there's not much correspondence between the original canvas and what you're actually working on. So to fix that, you need to select all of the objects that you're interested in for your graphic, and then click File, Document Properties, and then click Resize the Content. And what that does is it just fits the canvas neatly around your graphic that you're working on. And this is very useful when you then need to actually export your graphic, because then you don't have unnecessary white space. So if you do want to save this, it's quite easy. Of course, File Save As would do the trick. And you can save it as a SVG, or also quite conveniently would be to save it as a PDF. So then you can directly put it into LaTeX or into your documents that you're making. If you do think about, or if you do want it to be exported as an image, which is perhaps not recommended because it loses its vector graphics quality, but if you wanted to export it as an image, you click File, Export, and then you can modify width and height and resolution in the usual way here before identifying the location where you want to save it with the option down here, and then clicking Export to export the image. Okay, so now let's talk about the basics of image manipulation. Now, Inkscape is not a photo editing software, so it hasn't got quite as many sophisticated tools as you might find, for example, in Photoshop. But when you're creating scientific graphics, there's only really a few things you normally need to do with images in order to get them suitable for the final publication. And one of those things is cropping images, right? So cropping them to the dimensions, the shape and the size that you want. Now you might be used to, from say PowerPoint, being able to right click and then find some kind of crop option, but if you look carefully in Inkscape you'll find that that option doesn't exist. So cropping in Inkscape is a little bit more tricky than in say PowerPoint, but because it's a little bit more tricky, it's also much more general, okay, because you can crop arbitrary shapes out of other shapes in Inkscape. And the easiest way to show how to do this is as follows. So let's say I want to crop out some roughly circular region in the middle of this neuron. How would I do that? Well, I need to create a mask that corresponds to that circular region that I'm interested in. So I want to come over to the circle tool here, and I want to create that mask. Now, it doesn't matter at all what the appearance of this mask is, so it doesn't matter what its colors are or anything like that. The only thing that's important is the shape, because that's going to correspond to the shape that you will end up cropping. Just for illustration purposes though, I will make it a bit transparent so that we can see what's going on, and usually you probably want to do this so that you can work out exactly what you're cropping. Now, this neuron is now our image, and this red circle shape is our mask. And when you do cropping in Inkscape, you need to make sure that your mask is on top of your image. Okay, so if it's underneath, like this, you'll see quite clearly that the image is on top. In order to move it up a layer, just select the mask and then click Page Up. Okay, so each time you click Page Up, it moves up one layer. And then it will be on the top of your layers. Okay, so how do we do a crop? Well, you need to select simultaneously both the neuron and the mask. So do that with the select tool. Or in my case, I need to go out a bit wider. There you go. And then you need to go to Object, Clip, and then Set Clip. And you see what's happened? So it's clipped in the shape of that oval that we had selected, and now we have the cropped image of the neuron. Okay, so fantastic. So I recommend you play with that a little bit. You can Control Z to undo that, and you can practice different kinds of cropping. Like if you wanted a more regular kind of crop, which I suppose would be some kind of rectangular crop, then you can do that very easily. Just select both objects and then go Object, Clip, Set Clip, and there's your rectangular crop. So that's how you crop images in Inkscape. Another thing you might want to do to images is vectorize them, because, well, we can see an example of why we might want to do this with this image. It's very blurry, very fuzzy, and most certainly not of publication quality. So we don't want to spend, 2 days and a rainy afternoon kind of trying to recreate this whole figure. So how can we do this quickly? Well, in Inkscape there's a quick way to vectorize images. First of all, select the image. Then go to Path and click Trace Bitmap. And that will open up this right-hand panel here. Now, there's a lot of options here, but you don't need to be an expert in all of them. The first thing you'll notice is that you're in a single scan tab, and that is like a black and white bitmap tracer. And you can control the threshold for creating that bitmap here, and you can find some kind of nice intermediate threshold that should work pretty well for you. And then there you have it. That's a black and white bitmap trace of the image. So that was easy, but of course this might not be, and probably is not, what you're most interested in. You probably want some kind of color bitmap, some color vectorized graphic. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this because we're not going to need it anymore. So how do we create a color bitmap? Well, you go over to the multicolor tab under Trace Bitmap, and you go down to the colors detection mode. And already you see this live preview down here, which is quite handy. So you see it's more or less doing the right thing. One thing to note is that it's useful to remove the background, especially in an image like this, which has a rather almost white but not quite white background, so it's good to remove it. And you also have this stack option. It's recommended to select that. So what that does is it stacks up all of these scan layers that you're going to create from this detection algorithm, and it stacks them all up on top of each other so that you don't have, well, the whole image then looks a little bit kind of cleaner and smoother. It doesn't have all of these jaggedy bits from all of those different layers. So stacking is quite useful. Now, the scans option at the top is the number of scans that you take of the image, and this depends on how many different colors you have in your image. So if, like me, you have an image which doesn't have that many colors in it, so this maybe only has 2 or 3 colors, then a relatively small number of scans, and the default is 8, should be sufficient. But if you have an image that has many different colors, then you might want to increase the number of scans. But anyway, without further ado, we can click apply and we can see what this looks like. And we can move this away from our raw image that we have originally, and we can put them side by side. And you can kind of see what's happened here. So we've traced out a bitmap of the image, and it definitely looks sharper, definitely looks cleaner. It's almost, I would say, of publication quality. However, if you zoom in, you still see some little, arguably these little defects, right? These little color contrasts, which might not be what you want. So how do we deal with these? Well, remember that we had 8 scans. So that means that this object here is actually 8 different objects. And to find each object, just double click a few times and make sure you're with the normal select tool. And you should be able to then just peel off individual layers, just like this. And even at this point, you might look at what we have left over and you might think that actually looks like a good background for a neuron, so I'm happy with that. But you might look at this here and you might think, oh, that's too, too full of little bits, so I'm going to delete that. And then you might look at this layer here and you might think, well, that's almost okay, it's got what I need in the center, but it's got all these little bits on the outside, so how do I get rid of these bits? So naively, you might try just select them, right? You might try select, but you'll fail to do that because this is just a single object from a single scan. So it's only recognized as one object. So how do we break it apart into different objects? To do that, you select it, and then you go over to, let me get this right, I believe, it's called break apart somewhere, where is it? Oh yeah, here we go, path break apart. Okay, you click that, and now immediately you see it's been isolated into all its different component objects, and then now it's an easy game. You just select over the stuff that you don't want, you click delete, and you just repeat until you've got rid of all of the gunk that you didn't want in your image. And now this final layer, you can now move back where it was, and it fits quite nicely. And if you really wanted to be extra sure what's happened, you could then select all of this and you could click Ctrl-G to make it a single group, and now we have a lovely vectorized image. And you might want to even zoom in just to check what's going on. For some people, they might be happy with this kind of different colors going on in the background. For other people, they might be less happy, but that's okay. You can just decompose it into its different layers, and you can get rid of those if you don't want them. So that's how you vectorize an image in Inkscape. So now we're going to start thinking about how we can incorporate LaTeX into our Inkscape graphics. Now, we do this through an extension that we have to install separately. So this is additional to the baseline Inkscape download. You actually have to install an additional extension. And you can see, well, this extension is called TechText. And in the workshop document, you can see detailed instructions for Mac, for Windows, and also for Linux systems for installing this extension. Okay, so the only thing to really note here is that you need to have an offline version of LaTeX installed onto your machine before this extension will work correctly. So just be aware that downloading and installing LaTeX can be quite a time-consuming task on certain machines. So this could take a little while to set up from scratch. Okay, but once you've got it installed, there's an easy way to check if it was installed correctly. So you might have to restart Inkscape just to refresh the system, but then once Inkscape is reloaded, you can just go to Extensions, you can go to Text, and then you can go to Text, and you can just tap that link, tap that option, and it should open up this panel here. Now this central kind of text area here is just your usual LaTeX environment, so you have to respect all the rules of the game when it comes to LaTeX. So for example, if you want to create some kind of mathematical equation, you might want to create a mathematical environment like this, and you might then want to start writing your equation. So here's an example of what that might look like. And you can write a fraction here. So in my case, I'm creating some kind of partial differential equation. I can click preview to check if I made a mistake, which it looks like I have. Where is my mistake? Aha, my nabla was spelled incorrectly. Okay, so preview again. Okay, this time we've got what I wanted, so I can then click save. And here it is in Inkscape, although admittedly a little bit small, but that's nothing to worry about because this is now an object like any other in Inkscape. So I can select it, and then I can hold down Control and make it larger, and zoom out a little bit, and there we go. That's my equation in Inkscape. Now, because this is like any other object, it has all of those normal manipulations that we've kind of been learning about. So you can make it larger and smaller. You can, of course, tap again, and then you can rotate it if you like. You can also shear it if that's what you're interested in. And you can also give it color. Okay, so down here on the panel below, I can modify the color, or obviously as any other object, I can right click and I can click fill and stroke, and that will open up a color panel here that I can also manipulate. Now, it's worth bearing in mind that text is a little bit buggy. So for example, one mistake is that it's failed to kind of correctly identify this division line in the fraction. And what you might also find when you're using it is that if you if you have the text panel open and you try and do something else in LaTeX behind that panel, you might cause LaTeX to crash. Okay, so make sure that once you've finished with the panel, you close it before going back to the background LaTeX application. But just to reiterate the point that everything here is an object, I can like double click on the X, I can hold down Control and make it larger if I wanted, and I could make it a separate color as well. Okay, so once you get the hang of this, manipulating LaTeX in Inkscape is really quite a breeze. It's quite straightforward. There's one thing you do need to be aware of though, and we can go ahead to the workshop document just to have a look at this. And this is that by default, Inkscape has a very simple preamble that it uses for its LaTeX. Okay, so it only has a bunch of mathematics packages installed, but nothing else by default. What this means is that if you want to do something like maybe create an algorithm in LaTeX and put that into Inkscape, you might have a bit of a problem because you need to create a custom preamble file with a separate algorithms package. Also, if maybe you have some custom commands that you use on a regular basis, you will want to have a custom preamble that can use those commands. So how do we do that? How do we modify our preamble file in LaTeX? Okay, so it's quite straightforward. You just go to Extensions, Text, Text, just as before, the same panel here. And actually, what you can see is I'm already selecting a custom packages.txt preamble file. So this is located inside the workshop materials that you downloaded. By default, this might say something like default packages, okay? And default packages refers to just this little bit of code here. So not very much functionality. Now in my custom preamble, I've got some additional functionality. So for example, just to illustrate this, if I do /E, that represents a expectation operator, as you'll see here with the preview. And so for example, if I wanted to do the expectation of something, I have /V to represent a vector in my preamble file. So this will then make that a vector. And then we have it, that's the expectation of vector x. I can save that, and I can put that into the document just as before. So do go ahead and have a little bit of a play around with this LaTeX. Make sure you're comfortable with how it works. Make sure that if you have any bugs or any errors, you can figure out how to solve them. And after you've finished playing around with LaTeX, I have one final task for you all. So this is where kind of the tutorial part of the workshop finishes, and this is where you have some self-study time. So your task is as follows. So if you go ahead and click File, Import, and you find this PDF called Figure in Progress, and you just load that in to your Inkscape. Here it is. What this is just some example of a kind of visual abstract. It doesn't really matter what exactly it's trying to tell you, but it's just partially complete. It's not yet finished. And the completed version of this visual abstract, you can click File, Import, and click Figure Complete, and import that. You can see that what the completed version looks like. Okay, so it's got a few extra boxes, it's got a few more graphs, and in order to go from, what I want you to do basically is to go from this partially completed figure and to work out how to manipulate it from scratch to look like this completed figure here. And to help you with that, there are a few little components here like the free energy surface and this curve here. So you can import those as well. Those are PDF files, and they are found in the workshop materials. Diffusion smooth and free energy surface will help you there. And then of course you'll need to know how to create arrows, how to create smoothed rounded boxes, and how to import LaTeX correctly into Inkscape. Okay, so thank you for paying attention to this workshop, and I hope you found it useful.